Hello, and welcome back to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. Today, we are talking about something that I cannot remember being in my yoga teacher training. Now, I may have forgotten it. That's a very long time ago. And maybe it was mentioned quickly. And so I'm curious, were the kleshas included in your yoga teacher training? Do you remember learning about them in your initial yoga teacher training, or have you learned about them further? If you're like me and they were sort of skipped over, today's episode is for you. We're going to talk about the 5 root causes of suffering, or the 5 kleshas, with Michelle Cassandra Johnson, and I cannot wait. So let's get into it. If you're brand new here, hello and welcome. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also called the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. I'm a yoga teacher, mom of 3, entrepreneur, and forever student who loves to ask questions. That's how my brain works. It works in questions. That's what I've realized. And that's why podcasting feels like a good fit. I love that we can hang out and learn together. And I can really dig into some questions that yoga teachers are asking and sending to us to cover next. Because ultimately, this podcast was made for you, the yoga teacher. I remember how it felt to leave the first yoga teacher training and feel like, now what? Oh my gosh, I need way more training. I don't feel ready. How am I going to run this business? And so I wanted you to have a place where you could connect to other yoga teachers, ideas, and information so that you have a place to go to feel supported when you're busy doing life. Maybe you're driving or cleaning or doing whatever it is, walking the dog. That's a favorite place of mine to listen to podcasts and audiobooks. And so, thank you for being here. Returning listeners, a special shout out to you. Thanks for being here and hanging out again. Thank you also to OfferingTree for making today's episode possible. So if you've been listening to the podcast for a long while, you'll know that I use and love OfferingTree, the software, in my own business because it keeps everything simple and automated, and I'm all about systems that are automatic, like bookings, payments, Zoom links, reminders. I love that I can use it to book our podcast guests as well. So if you're looking for a software, or if you're thinking about creating a website or a membership, make sure to use our podcast listener discount code. That's over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. Shannon is spelled SHANNON. Again, that's offeringtree.com/Shannon. Also, someone sent me an email to say, Shannon, where can I sign up for your Yoga for Pelvic Health training? You can sign up right now online. There's a 20-hour training ready for you on demand. And if you're looking and wondering where is that, head on over to theconnectedyogateacher.com. Look under training. There's also a 3-hour one if you're like, well, I'm not sure I have 20 hours. And so I just want to do a little intro. You choose whether it's the 20-hour or the 3-hour. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com under training. Okay, this week we are diving into a topic many yoga teachers may not be familiar with, the kleshas. And we have a very special returning guest to talk to us about this, Michelle Cassandra Johnson, who actually wrote a book on this. So make sure to get Michelle's book if you're thinking, gosh, I want to learn more. Michelle is well known in the yoga community and has been on the podcast previously to talk about anti-racism and yoga. That's a special bonus episode that we did. I'll link to it in the show notes if you haven't heard it already. And also, here's just a quick introduction to Michelle in case you've never come across her work before. So she's an author and an activist. She's been a racial equity educator for 25 years and is also a yoga teacher and spiritual teacher and practitioner. She works one-on-one with people and in group settings to help them connect to their intuitive abilities. She supports people with intuitive healing practices. Her latest book that we talk about today is called Illuminating Our True Nature. It was released back in the summer, and we actually spoke way back then. Sometimes we book our interviews well in advance and then release them out into the world a little bit later. And so you're going to hear us talk about some gardening. Right now, as I'm recording this intro, there's snow on the ground. There's another winter storm coming. And it was really nice to have a listen to talk about gardening and beekeeping that Michelle does. And we mostly stick to what are the kleshas and how do they apply to our lives? Michelle shares practices to help us lessen suffering individually and collectively. And I love that she talks about how this is part of the book. We joke about how it's not just a quick fix, that it is a lifelong learning to learn how to reduce the suffering in our lives. But really, I want to say for me, this was a really much needed chat, especially as we're bearing witness to what's happening in the world right now. And if you've been having similar feelings, if you've been really feeling like there's a lot of suffering within your own life or around you, this is why we saved this episode to close out the year, because maybe you're thinking, I want to have a little less suffering for the new year. And so we wanted to share that with you to close out 2024. So let's dive in and hear from Michelle. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, Michelle. Welcome back, I should say. It is so great to have you here today.
Thank you for having me back on the podcast.
I'm excited that we get to dive in and talk about the kleshas, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, you are.
And really talk about also your new book. But before we do that, in case our listeners have not heard your previous episode or they haven't read any of your books, tell them who you are, what's the work that you do, and who do you do it for?
Great. So my name is Michelle Cassandra Johnson. My pronouns are she and her. And I live on the ancestral land of the Catawba, Cherawa, Tutelo, Saponi, Occaneechi, and many other tribes in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I am an author, an activist. I've been a racial equity educator for 2.5 decades now. 25 years, a while. I am a yoga teacher and spiritual teacher and practitioner. And I also work with folks one on one or within groups to help them connect to their intuition, intuitive abilities, to connect with rituals and practices to support them and the collective. And within some of those more intuitive healing practices, I also engage the practice of shamanism and entering into different realms to gather information to bring back to create harmony here in the middle realm, the earthly realm. And I do a lot of other things. I'm a beekeeper as well, which is yogic in nature, which I can certainly share more about. And my latest book, Illuminating Our True Nature, which I know we're going to dive into, came out on June 4th and published by Shambhala, and is an exploration of the kleshas, the root causes of our suffering. And I would say a through line in my work is both healing and understanding our suffering so that we can mitigate it and create conditions for liberation. That's the theme, and it happens in all of the different roles and ways I just described when I named some of my roles and shared a little about my work in the world. And that this relates to this question about who do I do this work for. I would say that I engage in the work around healing with different modalities in different contexts, individually and collectively for my ancestors, and for the now, right? What's playing out now, and for future generations. And I do this work for certainly humans, but I would say the larger ecosystem and the more than human world. And I regard the more than human world as a mirror and a teacher as well. So that's a little about who I am and what I'm up to.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I've been watching your beekeeping stories a little bit online, and that makes my heart so happy. I so feel a real connection to nature, and been talking with our listeners about moving to do that work a little bit more, like
Mhm.
being out in nature and connecting other people to nature more. So thank you for all of this that you're doing. I'm excited that we get to talk about the kleshas because I feel like let's start right from the beginning if we can. Like, how do you define the kleshas?
The kleshas are in book 2 of the Yoga Sutras. And for your listeners, people may be familiar with the Yoga Sutras, an ancient text that is often shared in Sangha community, in training, yoga teacher training, or continuing education training. And people who love ancient texts are drawn to the Yoga Sutras as well. The other text I'll just give a shout out to, because I've written about this other text, is the Bhagavad Gita, and I'd actually spent a lot more time with that text than the Yoga Sutras until I did a deep dive into the Yoga Sutras to work on this book project. They were not unfamiliar to me. I was familiar with them and had studied them a lot, actually, and had immersions and had just been more drawn to the Gita. And now I'm in love with both texts. So the Kleshas are, as I named, in book 2 of the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras, there are 4 books. The second book begins with the root causes of our suffering. There are 5 Kleshas. And after there is an introduction of the 5 Kleshas, and some information shared about how they relate to one another. This is in the Yoga Sutras, how they relate to one another. Then the path of Ashtanga, or the 8-limb path, is shared as a way for us to work through the root causes of suffering, the kleshas, and for us to mitigate suffering and hopefully become more liberated. Um, Yoga Sutra 2.12 shares the relationship between samskaras, which are tendencies or patterns related to our root causes of suffering, the kleshas, the 5 kleshas, which I'll name in just a moment, and how we experience these root causes of suffering. We create tendencies and patterns around them, samskaras, and this creates action and consequence. So we're suffering. There are patterns created around these. There are actions that emerge from our patterns and the root causes of suffering. There are consequences to actions, which this is karma. And this cycle continues unless we disrupt it in some way. And so the 5 root causes of suffering, or 5 kleshas, are avidya, which is often translated as a lack of clear sight, or the belief that we are separate. And these things obviously go together. If we are not able to see clearly or sense into what's going on in the truth, and particularly in a, I'm going to say in a dominant, if we think about dominant cultural norms and how they condition us to believe we're separate, this is the energy of avidya. Ashmita is the second klesha, and it is often translated as an over-identification with ego, which I can share more about. That's the essence of it, that we become wedded to ego, we become wedded to roles and identities, so much so that we forget our connection to all things. We also forget we are spiritual beings, which of course the path of yoga reminds us we are divine spiritual beings, and that divinity, humanity, resides within everyone and everything. The third klesha, raga, is translated as attachment to pleasure. So much so that we try to recreate pleasurable experiences, and the consequence of trying to recreate pleasurable experiences is that in some ways we're doing this to avoid pain, and so that we don't necessarily build our capacity to respond to pain as it arises, because we're chasing something that we believe brings us pleasure to sort of numb out that pain or avoid that pain. So there's a connection between what, the result of what happens when we are attached to pleasure. There's also a lot more I could say about pleasure and worthiness, and which I have gone into in the book. The fourth klesha is devesha, which is translated as avoidance or aversion. And you can probably see how that might connect to an attachment to pleasure. Devesha comes after raga. And this klesha, the energy of it is that we become so distressed or disturbed by things we perceive as disliking, or things we've been conditioned to dislike or believe that we dislike, that we become fixated and we want to annihilate that which we do not like at its core. And then I'd say the most intense expression of devesha that we are trying to annihilate, because we don't want to be confronted with whatever it is that we perceive disliking. And then the fifth klesha is abhinivesha, and abhinivesha is translated as a fear of death or a fear of letting go, a clinging to life or a clinging to the way things have been. And often I think about abhinivesha, and actually raga, the third klesha, and devesha, the fourth one, as connected to this amnesia, I would say, we have about things being temporary, or the way we are conditioned to hold on to things as they are without actually, embracing the truth, which is that everything is temporary, that all things will change, as the Gita says, as the Yoga Sutra shares as well, that, change is an evolution. This is the constant. This is what we can rely on. And we can engage this path to learn how to respond to change with more ease, with more grace, with less clinging, with less fear, with less pain. So there, obviously, in my book, I go into much greater detail, but you asked about the kleshas and what they are, and that's the introduction I would offer about how they're connected to samskaras and karma, and rooted in book 2 of the Yoga Sutras, and then what is the path for us if we want to disrupt the kleshas, which is the 8-limb path.
So do you think that each thing that we suffer with as humans can be put into one of these 5 things?
That's a great question. I do. And something I've explored in teaching and my own study and practice, and through this book, Illuminating Our True Nature, there are stories from my life and my experience. And then there are stories, of course, because I'm connected to the collective in all things, and history and now and the future. There are stories about the collective. And so there's an application of the kleshas, and a sharing of, this is an example of this in my life, or have struggled with it, or have seen this show up. And also, how are we seeing these things? A lack of clear sight, right? A forgetting of the truth of who we are. How are these things playing out and unfolding in our lives now, individually and collectively? The same is true of every other klesha. And, some examples of this, we were talking about nature a few minutes ago, and beekeeping, and, even guiding people into their connection with nature and of course, this is illuminating our true nature, which speaks to the fact that we are nature, and that so many of us have been conditioned to be divorced from nature, as if it doesn't exist within us, right? And isn't a quality or experience we have in these human bodies, that each one of the elements that is shared with us and shown to us within the more than human world is something we also embody, right? In each of the cycles of the season, something we embody. And so as I think about the five kleshas, I could apply that to the way we've been separate from nature, and what happens when we believe we are separate from the more than human world, and the delusion that occurs when we believe we are separate from the more than human world or separate from other humans, right? Again, which are also nature. Um, and also if I think about, I was speaking about avidya, if I think about Ashmita and I think about ego, right? If I believe that my needs are the most important needs, then I may not even regard the more than human world or other humans, sentient beings, right? I might think what I need is most important, what I desire is most important, and I'm going to get it at the expense of others. And this relates to the third klesha of raga. If I want to feel pleasure and my desires are more important, then I will extract and mine from the earth without any respect for it or any honoring of where things actually come from and the source of where things come from and the earth, right? And I might avoid at all costs, this is the fourth klesha, my connection to the earth and my impact on the earth as a human, and how I am contributing to climate chaos. I might avoid any of that because I don't want to look at that, and that makes me uncomfortable, and I don't like that, right? Or if I don't actually see the earth as me, then it's much easier to dislike it or disregard it. And then, of course, abhinivesha, the fear of letting go. The kleshas actually point to us and the path of yoga changing who we are, and an availability to be changed by the path of yoga. And if I'm clinging on to a belief system that I am above the earth and the more than human world, if we think about the hierarchy of humans to the planet, if this has been my conditioning and what I believe, and I want to hold on to this belief, right? And I'm actually afraid to let it go because it would require me to change how I regard the earth. Like, this is the energy of abhinivesha. So that's just an example of if we think about nature, the more than human world. But yes, I think about, the multiple genocides that are happening at this point in time, and a history of genocide and war and separation and disconnection, and not just war between humans, but again, that hierarchy. And I think about devesha and being so disturbed by that which I believe I do not like that I want to get rid of it. Right? To me, that explains so much of what is going on. So that's a long answer to your question. I feel like there's so much for us to explore with each klesha, and that this path calls us to study the root causes of suffering so that we suffer less, and ultimately, as I named earlier, become liberated. But it's not just about my liberation; it's about everyone's liberation. It's not just about now; it's about the future. It's not just about now; it's also about healing back and healing timelines, and really creating new ways of being. Or the path of yoga is ancient, so remembering old ways of being as we lean into these teachings of yoga.
This is amazing. Thank you so much for walking us through each one and giving the example of nature. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about this experience that I just had this week. I'm a volunteer hike leader, and we were at a meeting, and there was a woman there, and she's new to hike leading and new to the area, and she said, "What can we do?" This is really legit. I'm not making fun of her question and her inquiry. She was like, "What can we do about all the poison ivy that's all around us on the trails? It's making it less enjoyable for people." And there were many of us in that moment that said, really, the education has to come in that poison ivy is actually food for deer and birds, and it's a protection for some of the plants out there as well. And yes, it's a pain if you've ever had poison ivy.
Mhm.
It's really a pain for humans. And we are here as caretakers. So if we went in and we were like, let's eradicate all of the poison ivy, we would end up really harming many species, probably ourselves included. Like,
Right.
thank you for saying that we're all connected, and we can be pretty quick as humans to want to sort of control or blame or change the suffering that we're facing in nature. And I loved your examples of like the ego and the attachment, and I started to really think of this example.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you named about, there's an opportunity to remind people of how interconnected we are, um, and what it means to rid ourselves of something that makes us feel uncomfortable, what the impact might be on the rest of the ecosystem. Like, it is important to remind folks of that, myself included, because I'm not always present to that. And certainly living within a capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist, culture where there are hierarchies of, there's a hierarchy of bodies, which includes the ecosystem, right? Not just human bodies. And our conditioning around that and what we've internalized. And I'm sure that question was, or that inquiry around, can we just get rid of this, right, came from a place of like, it is uncomfortable, I don't want people to get it, some people are severely allergic, all of this is true, and yet we're in relationship with it. I've had poison ivy, it's no fun at all, and in fact I had to take steroids because I had such a bad case of it, right? So it's like no fun. And it is important for us to think about the more than human world and more than human needs that exist, and how we're in relationship with that, and how fragile actually. Often I think about the more than human world and how fragile it is because of humans, really, and what we're doing, and how resilient it is in response to what we're doing to the more than human world. As I said, how we're contributing to climate chaos, how we're asking the more than human world to adapt in response to us. But what if we adapted, right? Because we're in such deep relationship with the earth and we care about it that much. This is I think the work and the path of yoga, right? It doesn't say this path is, we're engaging with this path just for our liberation, as I named, and not just for human liberation. It's like, what does it mean to create conditions for liberation so the earth does not have to be so resilient and adaptable in response to us, right? And what if we think about reciprocity, and as we think about our relationship with the earth and actually all beings? So I appreciate you uplifting that example, because it may sound simple to people, but it's deep, right? It's like from deep internalization of, this is uncomfortable and I don't like it and I don't want to suffer in this way, and I may not want others to suffer in this way. And yet we're in this web with all things, and have to really think about our impact. And this is where intent and impact actually comes up for me, and the sharing of like, there can be good intentions with the actions that we take, and yet because of the fragility that exists in the more than human world, and I would say for humans as well, because of what we're doing to one another, we actually need to be thinking about those short and long-term impacts.
Hey, connected yoga teachers, I'm popping in here to tell you about a workshop that Billie Smith was running, and there's a replay. And I want to tell you about this because our sponsor, OfferingTree, puts webinars and workshops together for free for yoga teachers. You don't have to be an OfferingTree user to access the free trainings, workshops, webinars for yoga teachers. And I love that the replay for Billie Smith's workshop is available. So I was absolutely honored to be able to ask the questions to Billie. And we talked all about creating safer, more inclusive spaces, taking gendered language out of our classes, making it accessible to the queer community. And it's such a good workshop. So I'm going to link to it in the show notes. If you're like, gosh, I'm on the go here, can you tell me a quick link, Shannon? Sure, I will. Head on over to offeringtree.com/webinars and look for the one by Billie Smith, or maybe there's something else there that catches your eye. And if you're also thinking, hey, I need a way to book yoga students in. I need to create a new website. I need a website that's simpler. I need a place to store my videos and start a membership. Make sure to check out OfferingTree. And for sure, use our discount code if you're thinking, yeah, this is the right fit for me. That's over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. So not only does this company, share really helpful resources, workshops, webinars, trainings for free with yoga teachers, but they also have an amazing software that I recommend all the time to yoga teachers and studios. Alrighty, let's get back into today's episode with Michelle Cassandra Johnson. You had also brought up, which is so top of mind for me, and I think many of our listeners, many of the humans on the earth, the multiple genocides right now. And when I sit here and think, well, and then you also talked about, okay, here's how we can decrease the suffering. My immediate response is like, well, one thing I could do is and I want to name this as I'm being a little bit sarcastic because I've heard this solution is just shut the news off, Shannon, and go do your yoga practice and go be out in nature, which these are the things that I sometimes do to not have so much suffering. But I think this is probably, I'm trying to look at is this Devesha? Is it is it me? Am I also contributing to suffering by thinking, I'll just avoid this?
I mean, this is a great question. And just, curiosity. And I've wondered the same in a way because I am pretty protective of my, I don't even want to call it self-care. I'm protective of practices that help sustain my spirit. And the reason I'm protective is so that I can show up in service of the collective. So there's an intention. And sometimes this looks like me going out to my beehives and sitting with them for an hour as the world's on fire. People don't have enough food. There are multiple genocides going on. The political context, I don't even know if I have words for it. I mean, it's all intertwined, all of what I just named. I don't really have words for that. And so I'll go and sit, and sometimes I will wonder, am I avoiding? And I actually think I'm trying to gather some energy and come back to myself so that I can show up and engage with care and intention in response to the suffering in the world. Now, if I consciously sort of said, I don't want to look at the news because it makes me feel uncomfortable and I don't want to see what's going on and I don't understand what's going on. And I want to say, I don't understand what's going on. And sometimes I don't want to see the images that are being shared, right? And sometimes I do look away. I want to, because it's overwhelming for my system to see the atrocities that are occurring. And it's also odd for me to be looking at it on my phone. It's it's just a weird time to be scrolling and looking at trauma. And it's more than trauma, but certainly it's trauma, right? To be looking at that. That's odd. But if I'm doing that to bypass or to make myself believe that it's not happening, that to me feels different, right? If I'm I'm aware this is happening, and I don't know everything that's happening, but I'm aware there are multiple genocides happening. I'm aware the climate chaos, things are it's warmer, right? The temperature has risen and glaciers are melting, right? I just read about one of the final glaciers melting yesterday. And so I'm aware that these things are going on, and I don't believe I can bypass that this is the relative truth that is unfolding. And I want to engage with it enough and with care so that I can show up and respond to how suffering exists within the relative or on this in this plane, the earthly realm, the relative plane. But I also need practices to come back to myself so that I am not contributing more, right, to the suffering, and I'm not contributing chaos. The atrocities that I'm watching and seeing and reading about and feeling into because I'm connected to all things and have practices that remind me of that. If I'm constantly bombarded with these things and an awareness to the degree to which my nervous system has been hijacked and I'm not in my body anymore, I'm probably going to go create a lot more suffering because I'm not grounded. And sitting with my bees for an hour grounds me enough to then go back into whatever it is. And it's not that I'm escaping. I sit there and look at them and I think about how they're suffering too, right? I sit and I pray for them. I sit and I ask what they need. So that's not even a bypass. I sit and thank them for feeding me and pollinating food and being in such deep connection with other parts of the ecosystem and in communication with other parts of the ecosystem in ways that I don't understand in my human body, right? The relationship with flowers and the sun and water and pollen and tree resin. And so I just offer it as an example in response to what you named. Like if we're going to take action, we need to do it from a steady and a grounded place. And we need to do it. I think we need to be so centered and within ourselves. This is different than ego. We need to have come back to ourselves to recognize the truth of who we are, which would also then allow us to recognize the truth, the light, the connection, the love, the humanity that exists within all beings. Like this is what we need to remember and practice to show up with steadiness and to be unwavering and to show up for the long haul. So that is what I would say to people who might be like, am I avoiding this because I don't like it? It's a great question, and continue to ask yourself that, or I don't want to see it. And also ask yourself, is my nervous system so overwhelmed that looking at this is going to make me move out of my body so much so that I forget I'm human? Because so much of what is happening and unfolding is because we're not embodied. We've forgotten we are human. We've forgotten humanity. We've forgotten shared humanity, right? And so I would invite people into both of those inquiries and curiosities of like, what is at the root of why I need to practice, whatever it might be in the moment, and is it a bypass, or is it because I actually need to come back to myself enough to then engage with steadiness and from an unwavering stance.
That's so helpful. Thank you. Because I really relate to many of those things of like going out, being in my garden, or going for a walk, or just feeling the difference that being in relationship with nature will bring me. And then feeling like, well, I want more of this, you know,
Mhm.
and also having moments where I'm feeling like I might see the flowers like in the wind this morning, like I was looking at the pollinators all over my cilantro flowers, so it's going to seed. And I had this immense sadness and grief and gratitude all at once that I have a piece of land that I can nurture and care for, and the freedom to do that and without like worry. And my mind immediately goes to, Palestinian friends who do not have
Mhm.
that ability at all. Uh,
Mhm.
and that for me, that connection with the earth really reminds me, and not just in Palestine, but in many places in the earth on the planet where, land has been fought over and stolen and
Right.
damaged. That's probably one of the hardest things, like for me to see, is like what's happening to the olive trees and like what people are doing to the earth in the name of whatever their belief system is. So thank you for saying like it's also something that you think about.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, and you mentioned the olive trees and what people are doing to the earth. And of course, we're thinking, what people are doing to each other. And it points back to this hierarchy of human to earth, because I don't know. I would guess that when someone is like bombing an area, that I don't know what people are thinking, because I haven't done that. But what I want to say is that are people thinking I'm annihilating a people, and not thinking about I'm annihilating a people and the earth, like the impact, right? And so I so appreciate what you're naming, because I think, yoga points at like all of that matters. What happens to the air when the body, it's like, and we're breathing that in, right? And we embody air, that element, right? There's just so much to what you just named that feels so important for people to connect to, as well as we are responding to these horrific things that should not be happening, that in fact are against nature. They're against the laws of nature, like what is happening, the things we're talking about in the relative truth. And they're actually very counter to the path of yoga and the things that we've been talking about and have uplifted about the path and the absolute truths about who we are to each other and who the earth is to us. And if you're feeling grief when you're looking at the pollinators, and also thinking, I'm grateful for this land, and I'm grieving that not everyone has this. To me, that's not avoidance. That's like seeing the multiple like layers of what is present in a moment when you're looking at your cilantro plant going to seed, right? You're not just looking at the plant, you're looking at the beings on the plant. You're thinking about the land and your connection to the land. You're thinking about what we are doing to the land, the earth. You're thinking about, oh, I have this land and other people don't necessarily have access to land like this. Oh, what's happening to people's lands? What's happening to their homes? What's happening to their sense of place and belonging? Right? So that, to me, that's not avoidance, and that's not the other place. That's not avidya. That's not a belief that you're separate, because you're looking at a plant, which some people would walk by that plant and not even notice it. You're looking at it and you're seeing, and you're having this multi-layered experience and response to it, because you recognize you're in relationship to the plant and everything else that is connected to it. And you're aware that, oh, as I think about the world, like what is happening, right? I have this moment of peace, or I have this peaceful place and moment of grief, right? And other folks don't have that space at all. And so I would just, whatever the cilantro plant is for people, right? For me, it's my honeybees, it's my garden, it's the sunflowers that are about to bloom, right? It's the trees and the clouds and the water. It's, whatever that is for folks to engage with those sentient beings. And we're centering around the more than human world. But of course, we can do this with other humans. We can do this with each other. To think about what is my equivalent to these things that have been named from the more than human world, and how can I actually allow myself to feel all of the things that we just named: grief and gratitude, connection and an awareness of disconnection, an awareness of strife and violence, and the ways in which humans do things that are counter to nature, that are not aligned with nature. So thanks for offering that, Shannon.
Thank you for all of that, because that was really, oh my gosh, I love listening to you sort of like us have this back and forth of like, it's very complex when we're out there, what looks
Yeah.
like just looking at the bees or just looking at a flower. I do want to say, I think that a couple of things. I have this idea that this was from when I was very young. It was encouraged to really notice nature. So my dad would bring newspapers in and set them on the table, and then bring in like snails or slugs so that we could just sit there and watch them. And um, it was really encouraged to notice what's going on, and to just be very still and quiet, and also take care of that snail or slug. Sure, it might have been a little traumatic for it to come in the
Mm-hmm.
house and like take it back outside where we found it, and really nurture it. I also want to say, I want to share this other thing, that when you talked about this disconnect, and we're going to stick this right in the middle of the podcast so that this person doesn't, This person will never listen to a topic on the Kleshas, I don't think. I know a couple, they're Canadian, and she is super passionate about native plants and educating people about taking care of the earth and pollinators and all of the things. And her husband creates bombs and takes them personally, like goes to Israel and
Mm-hmm.
and for me, it's like, can you not see you might be taking care of this one little acre here and educating people about pollinators? Where is the disconnect that you cannot see that that land over there is just as important as yours?
Yeah. I mean, that's deep, right? And it's also our conditioning. I mean, the path of yoga in so many ways is about us shedding our conditioning and at a minimum interrogating our conditioning and then shedding what is not aligned with nature in all the ways we've talked about nature and what is not aligned with living into our shared humanity and seeing that and our connection with the more than human world. And I can, if I sit with it, I'm sure I could think about 10 ways right now that I'm not aligned. And so your example that you just gave is this really stark sort of contrasting example of like, I'm going to protect this land and I'm going to educate and I'm passionate about pollinators and raising consciousness and awareness about this. And I have a deep connection to the land. And my partner, right, is responsible, at least in part, for building weapons that will harm other people's land. That is, it feels like a sort of big example of disconnection and a result of conditioning and individualism, even, I would say. And I can think of all the ways that I've been taught that I'm not in relationship with other humans, particularly humans that I may never meet, that are all the way across the globe, right? That I don't feel like I'm in relationship with. I would also say, particularly with the more than human world and sentient beings that may actually live on my land, right? That I'm not aware I'm in relationship with. And so I want to get rid of them or pull that weed or get rid of that plant or kill the mosquitoes. By the way, I don't actually spray for mosquitoes, but and I just get bitten or wear long sleeves. But like there's the way I'm just dissociated from, right? Because I'm not day to day experiencing people across the globe, except on my phone and with these images that are breaking my heart over and over and over. And I feel like, what can I do about this? What can I do? Right? There's some things I can do, but really, what can I do? There's that example. And then there's what's happening in my yard, what's happening in my community, what's happening as I think about, where I live and everything I'm in communion with, and how am I disconnected from, other beings, my community, right? My neighborhood, the space I'm in. So I just want to invite people into that inquiry for themselves, because we are making decisions all of the time that may be coming from a misaligned place and a lack of recognizing our connection to all things. I mean, when I order something and don't know where it's from, and I wrote about this in the book, right? Like when I'm mindlessly ordering things and I don't actually know who made it and I don't know the source, but I want to get it the next day. And I want it to be convenient for me. That's the way I'm harming the planet. If I think about climate chaos and greenhouse gas emissions, I am not connected to where things come from and source and the working conditions of the people creating whatever I'm ordering, right? When I could go get it locally, I'm not supporting my local economy. It may take longer, may be more difficult to find, but I'm not supporting my local economy, right? And so I just want to invite people into that, because I think that's it's the juicy place and it's uncomfortable. Because again, the path of yoga and the kleshas and the things we are uplifting, which are all connected to the path of yoga, call us to change. And so when I become aware, when I feel into what it means that I have a deep relationship to the land, and yet my partner is building weapons is annihilating people and their land, right? Their sense of place. When I feel into that and I allow myself to feel it, it will call me to change something, probably many things. And that is painful and difficult. And to me, that's often what people want to avoid, right? Transformation is not easy in the way we're talking about it. And there are these other examples that we all could turn and look at ourselves or take a look in the mirror and be like, how am I doing something similar? It may not sound as bad, but how am I contributing to the suffering on the planet? And in what ways can I shift that?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you brought this around to like, let's see how we're doing that ourselves. Like, let's look internally. Ooh, that's
Yeah.
good. That's gonna sit with me for a while. Okay, now let's get into relieving the suffering. Like, let's get tell me the 3 quick steps to not suffer anymore. That's what I
As
want.
you can tell from our conversation, right? It's not 3 quick steps. And what I will say is that in my practice and study and in the book, um, there are 5 sections. There's a section dedicated to each klesha, and each section ends with some practices. So I mentioned in book 2 of the Yoga Sutras, the kleshas are introduced, and then the path of Ashtanga and 8-limb path of yoga is shared as how we can. And earlier in the Yoga Sutras, Kriya Yoga is explained as well. And so some of the practices include embodiment, so asana, coming into the body, feeling the body, working with the body, transforming the body, in the spirit of this transformation we were just talking about, right? The deep change. There, in each section, there's a pranayama practice, which of course is related to shifting our state of being, shifting our state of mind, shifting and actually understanding how the mind works and how it turns in patterns within the mind, which are samskaras, which are connected to root causes of suffering. And so there are pranayama practices to understand more about the mind and also to shift our way of being, our way of thinking, which will then impact or shift the way we show up. There are mantras, which each either call in a different archetype or energy, or are calling for something to vibrationally shift within a space, within us, of course, but within the space around us. There are meditations. So I chose things from the path, right, in a response to the kleshas and the ways we suffer. So meditations are there, and mudras, different positions that we might hold with our hands to embody a particular archetype to meet the times that we are moving through and all of the conditions that we have explored thus far in our conversation. So I just want to let people know that there are also a gazillion journaling prompts, and then these practices which are meant to be returned to again and again to see what happens right within myself when I engage in these ways with these practices, which may seem simple, but the intention behind them is it's not necessarily simplicity. It's more clarification. It's more getting to the root of what's going on, and it is the return to what we've named about true nature and connection. Right, that is the point. Um, these practices almost function like divining rods, right? We find the source, we feel the source, and it's it can be quick, the impact on us, right, when we do that. And the other thing I'd say is that for us to mitigate our suffering, which this is the point of the kleshas and the exploration of them, we have to understand why we suffer and how we suffer. That's not a read Illuminating Our True Nature one time or read just read this text, right? It's an ongoing practice and study. And it's a muscle to build that we need to build, right? To be with our suffering, to try to understand it when actually, there are 1,000 distractions every day. And I'm incentivized to look away from the root causes of suffering, and systems certainly incentivize me for looking away from how they create suffering, and humans within systems create suffering for other humans in the more than human world. So we need to ask questions. Like, what is at the root of our suffering individually and collectively? And do we want to get free? And if we do, right, if we desire liberation, not just individual liberation, collective liberation, what are we willing to do? And in what ways are we willing to change to create that liberation so that there is more ease, there is more peace, and there is alignment with nature and the laws of nature, and the path and practice of yoga, which is a way of living and being, which is very much aligned with nature. So I would invite people into that inquiry, and then the ripple effect that comes from curiosity, which is change, right? Ultimately, if we're curious enough, we're then directed to change in some way. And this is how we mitigate our suffering, that there's a willingness to change and be changed. There's a willingness to risk something. There's a willingness to acknowledge how I'm implicated in the suffering that is unfolding on the planet. There's a willingness for me to look at my own suffering and how I reenact suffering when I don't attend to my suffering and try to create a different experience for myself, right? Not a bypass, as we talked about, but a transmutation of suffering. So not 3 steps, but a lifelong journey of exploration of suffering.
We have to keep going on it. Okay, I was just joking with
I know.
It's the way the brain goes, though. It's just like, let's do this so we can quick move on to not suffering. Which one of these kleshas do you think was the most challenging, or like kind of shows up like, oh, here you are again? And then do you have a practice that helps you with that?
I love this question. I think so. I struggle with all of the kleshas, and I would say most people I know do. And the one that comes up for me, perhaps more than others, because I feel avidya is like a belief we're separate. I actually think I was born here in this incarnation to be of service to the collective, and I feel that's like my North Star. Like I feel like it's not that I do it all the time, but it's that I am driven by that, right? Or ego. I'm always talking about ego and identity and how we actually need to remember we're part of a collective. But the third klesha, raga, an attachment to pleasure, or that which I think I like, I think that's one that has been a challenge for me, because, and I was talking to someone the other day about this. I noticed in 2020 when COVID was here and many of us were isolating, I noticed some new patterns, or maybe a like intensification of some old patterns of, I'm sitting alone in my house. I'm watching hours of TV. I'm drinking wine while I'm watching TV. I don't taste the wine, right? I'm ordering stuff online. I'm not sleeping, getting up, like I noticed these consumption, like these patterns of consumption, that all of the things I just named, that really, I think, took root because of isolation and uncertainty and boredom and fear and all the things I must have felt then. I wouldn't say it was pleasurable. And I write about this very candidly, to like watch hours of TV. Like I felt like I'm wasting my brain. Like my brain will be mush. What am I doing right now? I was doing all the other things. I was writing, I was teaching online, but I was like at night doing these things that they were not feeding my soul or spirit. And so I'd be aware of it. And I thought I liked doing them. And then sometimes I'd be like, you don't even like doing this. So why are you doing it? And then that's its own thought pattern, right? Of judgment, or how is this helping you get to your, how is this aligned with why you're here, which again is to be of service to the collective. And so I think I struggled a lot with that. And I don't know that it was I wanted to recreate pleasurable experiences. I think it was the time that we were living through. And yet it's been difficult to break some of those patterns, because for a year or however long, I was like in my house, other than going to the grocery store and a few other places. And so that is the one I would say I struggle with the the most. I also want to name that I am a Leo, if astrology matters to people, and Leos can be rather indulgent and actually really like pleasure, and not just for themselves. They can like want to create the pleasurable experience for everyone else as well. And so I don't want to, I'm not blaming my astrology. I'm just saying, I think in my energy, there is some of that too, of like indulgence and abundance, which I don't think is a negative thing. I think it's how we relate to these parts of, self, and how we understand these parts of who we are. And I really want to be doing things that nourish my soul and spirit. So that was the difficult one. The practice was some of what I just did, actually, which is get curious, try not to judge myself, think about what would feed my soul and spirit truly, and to engage more in those activities, even within the context of isolation, right, of limited social contact. And, having bees here, having a yard, having a garden, right, all of these things actually really helped me. And what I'll say, the essence of the practice feels like it's about expansiveness versus the narrowness that can happen, of course, when we're isolated, but also, and we're scared, the contraction that can happen. But also when I'm like, addicted to these patterns that aren't feeding my soul and spirit. Nature always feeds my soul and spirit. And so thank goodness I had access to spaces and animals and energies on my land where I live, to be able to remind myself, oh, there's something bigger happening here. And this is what it feels like to have your soul and spirit fed, right? This is what it is. So notice the contrast in this expansiveness and the narrowness, and even sort of emptiness that can happen when we're addicted to things that we think bring us pleasure, but actually they aren't nourishing us in the ways we need to be nourished. So that's what I'd say.
I appreciate this share so much. And I think many of us can relate going through a global pandemic. And yeah, thank you. If our listeners are wanting to read your book and connect more with you, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, so you all can go to michellcjohnson.com, which is my website, and it's updated regularly with different events. There's also a tab on that website for my books. Illuminating Our True Nature is my 5th book. And you can, if you order it, you will gain access to some Dharma talks, 5 Dharma talks, and some practices from the book. And you can purchase Illuminating Our True Nature anywhere books are sold. So you could, if you're in a community where there's an independent bookstore, you could go there, or do bookshop online, or indie books. There are a lot of places, or there are many other places you can order it. And I teach many different immersions, workshops, experiences online and in person. And we'll have more coming up, including a book club, which I'm going to schedule soon, focused on illuminating our true nature. And often I've done some book readings and workshops. They're a combination of some readings from the book and some practices from the book and some discussion. So that's where people can find me and find, out more information about all of the different things that I offer.
That's really exciting that there's a book club coming up, and also some practices, like kind of doing it in community. That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and also for taking the time to chat with us today about the Kleshas. I'm really curious now to hear from our listeners, like what questions do they have further about the Kleshas, and yeah, and how are they noticing this in their own world, their own life?
Yeah, thank you for having me and being in conversation with me about the Kleshas. And I hope the listeners have questions and are more curious about this part of the Yoga Sutras and the path and practice of yoga. So thank you for inviting me to be here.
Thank you. If our listeners do have questions, they can post them in the comments of the show notes, and that way we can kind of continue the conversation there for sure. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Oh my gosh, what a beautiful book you've written. What an amazing way to apply this to our lives right now. I love that there are practices that we can include, and I for sure really hold tight to my heart the conversations around being part of nature, maybe feeling disconnected from that. You know, all of the messages that we can get when we stand in stillness and notice in nature. And so this is my invitation, connected yoga teachers. If you are feeling like you are suffering right now, try and go out in nature. See how that feels. See if you can really notice something in nature. Also, check out Michelle's book for sure. There's many practices that you can use in your life to reduce suffering. And also, I'm curious to hear if you're sharing this with your yoga students. I think it's so magical when we can start to look at something like the Kleshas or the koshas or the 8 limbs of yoga and really bring that into our own practice, embody that, and then share that with our yoga students. We have other podcasts about the koshas and the 8 limbs if you want to check those out as well. I love a good intention for a yoga class, and I love it when they're rooted in yoga philosophy. Okay, all of the links are on our show notes page, which is over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/387 for this episode. You can also tell us what you think of this episode. You can leave a comment. You can leave questions there. If you're feeling like, I want to actually use my voice and leave Shannon a message, you can do that over at our website, theconnectedyogateacher.com, and there's a button right there on the website that says, leave a voicemail. As I said, connected yoga teachers, as I'm recording this episode, we have snow on the ground. It warmed up a little bit, and I see massive amounts of snow coming for us in the forecast. And so if you want to catch up with me while I walk outside, no matter what the weather is, because 1, I have a dog, and 2, I made a promise to myself years ago when I was struggling in winter to get outside every single day. The dog makes sure of it now. If you want to follow along and hear the crunching of the snow and see the wild storms that we get up here in Canada, follow me on Instagram. I'm over at The Connected Yoga Teacher, and reach out on there. Say hello if you've listened to this episode. I just got a note from Shannon, another Shannon, listening to the episode that we released with Jeevana Heyman, just saying like, thank you so much. I love listening to this episode, and I love getting feedback like that. So I also need to say thank you to our team over here, Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead, who make the podcast possible, help the yoga teacher community in so many ways. Thank you to them. They make this work way easier, and really, they are amazing people with like huge hearts who really care. It's amazing to work with them. Thank you also to you, dear listener, because without your time here, the podcast would not even be possible. So I'm going to close out with the question that I've been asking for almost 9 years now. Wonder when I started asking this question, but it's almost 9 years of this podcast, which is wild. Okay, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community, so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?